Hello, this is the introductory lecture for Formations of Modernity that you missed this Tuesday, and we do apologize for this, but there was a problem with the venue that was selected for the module. This has changed now, so we resume as usual. I resume as usual after Professor Saeed's two lectures this Thursday and on Tuesday next week. So you will have a lecture with me as normal on Thursday next week. So this is really a more general introduction to the module, because sometimes students ask us, how do the 2-3 blocks that we present connect? Because we have guest speakers, guest lecturers every few weeks. And I want to show you that they do connect, they form a unity, and there is a rationale behind what we offer to you. So just to begin, I would like to give you some definitions. Sometimes we omit definitions and they really matter. We talk about modernity, then we talk about modernization, we talk about postmodernism. What are these things? And of course the whole module is based on them. So I'm going to give you a few tips as to what they are and what they do for this module. Modernity first. Modernity has at least two definitions, approaches in this module. The first one is the more institutional one, the more structural definition. So when we use it this way, we are talking about modern society and more specifically industrial civilization. And in more detail, this is associated with industrialization as a process. Yes, so things such as the rise in factories, industrial production, and then behind that, of course, you have an economic institutional kind of rationale, and this has to do with markets. Yes, so we have a market economy that supports industrialization and industrial expansion. So we need some institutions, really, when we are talking about the large structures, political institutions as well as economic. So the economic ones are what I already mentioned. The other institutions have to do with the construction of states. This is a new phenomenon, a new-ish, 19th century phenomenon. So this includes the nation-state. This started mainly in Europe, but I'll say a few more things on this. Also, a kind of political organization that we associate with democracy. Not democracies as we had in small city-states in antiquity, as in Athens, yes, but mass democracy. And as a result of these things, modernity is vastly more dynamic. This is one of the things that was explored by sociologist Anthony Giddens in his work, who looks at these large structures and examines how they produce social order. So that's a structural definition. But there is another one which is more experiential. It's how we experience modernity and what it does to identities and subjectivities, the ways we are in the world, the ways we behave. This is what we call an ontological definition of modernity. So we are talking about a formation of modernity which is defined in terms of identities and also social practices that constructed in relation to the ways we choose to live. Yes, choosing to live in a particular way connects, of course, to the kinds of institutions we choose to fit ourselves into, but also communities. And communities are not necessarily institutions. They have a kind of more invisible, let's say, experiential aspect in their existence. So, in this respect, modernity is really a set of attitudes towards the world. It's the idea of the world as open to transformation. We will talk about what happened after the emergence of the nation states, which are a bit more structured. Other ways of being and behaving emerged that actually defied and even rejected sometimes the idea of the nation states being a national citizen. This is what we call the cosmopolitan kind of imagination. One of the colleagues in sociology will talk to you about that. And at the same time, this involves conceptualizations of being in particular places and spaces and the experience of time, how we perform our identity, ways of knowing about culture and society, embodied ways of knowing. Just to give you some examples here, I put a couple of pictures in this slide for a reason. Not all societies and cultures in the world experience the world in the same way. And this is really the ontological kind of dimension of modernity. Take as an example the pilgrimage to Mount Arafat for the second day of the Hajj. I'm talking about the Muslim pilgrimage that happens every year. This is really, it has a kind of religious, very strong religious dimension, and it's a community building dimension. It's experiential. It is something that Muslims share, but at the same time experience individually as they try to connect to Allah inside them. When we talk about pilgrimage now, in tourist contests, commercialized ones, we use the same term, but we actually mean something completely different. So in Western cultures, which are not Muslim, you will find people performing kind of pilgrimages, but they are completely different. First of all, they are mostly secular in their nature, and second, they are much more individualized. So this idea of connecting to a God, of perfecting your behavior in preparation for the afterlife, etc., doesn't exist. And yet we use the same term and to describe basically two completely different things. So time and space here matters. Yes, especially space, how we perform the pilgrimages, where and to what purpose, and what kinds of knowledges we obtain through them. Now, I said modernity and then I said modernization. They are not the same thing. This is something that we strive to explain also in the second year. So pay attention because it will come back to haunt your dreams if you don't understand it now. Modernization is different from modernity as a set of characteristics that we find in large-scale social integration processes. So it is really about process and about things that happens incrementally. Yes, modernization is a process. Modernity is a condition. So what kind of processes are we talking about? We talk about the rise of big cities. Yes, urbanization, another term that ends in ISATIN. We are talking about industrialization, yes. We are talking about capitalism. We're talking about mobilities, large, mass scale mobilities of people, labor, and also goods, capital, also information. Yes, this is what happened really in modern years, especially after industrialization kicks in the West, in Western Europe. People move from the countryside to the cities to find jobs there in factories. This means that they form completely different communities. They increasingly become particular types of workers. So we have the increased division of labor, the specialization that we find in labor, and then of course the division of people into classes, yes, social stratification. So these are all part and process of the process of modernization. And this leads also, of course, according to some social theorists, to the dehumanization of experience. People become more competitive, more alienated, etc., etc. But we'll get to that point a little bit later. So that's what modernization is. Modernity is a condition, modernization is a process. Now, I quite like also providing some etymological connections so that you see how all these things come to life. Modernity and modernization come from the same root, from the Latin modo, which means presently. Yeah, what happens now? And it is interesting that they started their life as a way of distinguishing the now of Christianity from the previous pagan era. And of course, what we mean today about when we talk about modernity and modernization is quite the opposite. We are talking very much about the secularization of human experience, practice, and organization, and human order. Yes, but that's how it started. Yes, and of course, it started like that for a reason, because there was a need to distinguish what happens in mundane situations, yes, in everyday life, from things we would experience in very special, sacred situations and sacred time, which is, of course, the time of religion. But that's the past. So if modernization is all these things, then modernity is the existential state, how we feel about the changes that we experience. It is also, in sociology, when we are talking about modernity, we are talking about the ways scholars study all these changes, yes, and reflect on them, and they analyze them, yes. So it's a particular way of reflecting on and imagining and deliberating, let's say, on social formations and ways of life. Yes, this is part and parcel, anyway, of what Mills, a very well-known American sociologist, called the sociological imagination. Something that connects to the personal, to the collective, the biographical, to the structural, and so on and so forth. Not just at the level of experience, but also of social organization. Okay, these are the really general kind of observations on some concepts that underpin the rationale of this module. Where does this module fit, really? Why do we use them? How do we use these ideas? There are certain things that this module is trying to do for you. It asks big questions, yes, the broad questions of social change, how they happen, with what kind of social consequences for world societies. So it looks at things macro sociologically. But then we also look at what happens at the meso level, the level of organization, human organization, into smaller communities, and then also more micro, the ways individuals live, in families, for example, in their immediate environment. So it tries to connect these three levels: the macro, the meso, and the micro. We will move across centuries. All these centuries are part and parcel of what we came to understand. What happens, it leads and culminates to what we understand as modernization and the study of modernization, that is modernity. So there is a historical and a theoretical element in what we will discuss, because we look at the things in their long duration from different analytical perspectives. Now, the analytical perspectives, I will show you in a while a few things and discuss them, because they connect to different blocks in the module. But in any case, the other thing that we're trying to do is to not be too geographically specific, but look at how different areas of the world that have been divided on the basis of their productivity or the general understanding by others as developed or underdeveloped, how they have been divided politically as well as economically and culturally. So we'll talk about the global north, yes, where we are situated now, because it's the developed part of the world, and it's the place from which both industrialization and imperialism and colonization of other parts of the world happened. And then we'll move also to see what happens in the global south, and we'll do this across centuries. This is allegedly the more underdeveloped or dubbed backward area of part of the world. And we have to be a bit selective, because we can't do everything. So have a look at how our world is really split here. It is split into two halves, and you can see that the lower half involves all the places that still face economic problems, yes, or the more severe ones. And actually some of these problems intensified in more recent decades because of other changes, natural and political. Think about climate change. Who suffers most? It's the people and the countries that have the least resources. We will think about this split in critical terms. Yes, one of the things that the module is trying to do is to teach you to think a little bit more critically about the ideas you are confronted with and facts, or what we take as facts. So we'll start thinking in this module about the sources of power. Yeah, so when we talk about development and modernization, who does this? Who decides that one country or one region is more modernized and more developed than the other ones? So it's a point of comparison, let's say. Okay, let's see a little bit what happens within blocks, because what we did was to split the module into blocks, and we try more or less to adopt a kind of historical perspective. So there is a kind of chronological development. At the same time, it has to be conceptual and analytic. So the first block talks about structures. Yes, the large structures. It prompts you to think about the organization of power in modern institutions. And when we are talking about modern institutions, we will go back a little bit to colonial times, but there are also other institutions that emerged a little bit after colonialism that connect actually to colonialism. One of them is the nation state. Yes. Nations and nation states. Most of these structures have to do with European and Western forms of organization originally, I stress. So the lectures will cover the conceptual origins of colonialism, why colonialism connects and how to Europe, the idea of Europe, why it produced and how it produced what we call Eurocentrism, which persists, yes, in the ways we think sometimes and write about the world, yes, and about modernity. So we will think about European colonialism as a monologue on modernity. And then we're going to move on to think about nations, the emergence of nations. Of course, this emerged in Europe. Which posits a real problem because, of course, we have nations everywhere. And so many scholars ask, when we have the emergence of nations and nation states, yes, their institutional counterparts, as it were, in countries such as India, are they just derivative of the European processes that we find in the 19th century? Yes? Or there is more there to it? And that's a really important question to ask because, again, it takes you back to the idea of Eurocentrism and the domination of the West on the world. From structures, we move to agencies, yes, because every time you have structural impositions and pressures on people and whole communities, there is a response, yes, there is a reaction. So how did this happen in modern ways? How communities and individuals responded to these pressures? Of colonialism, of nationalism, yes, of being asked to belong to a particular national community. Does everybody want that? The answer is no. So we have, as a reaction, the emergence of agencies, and we are talking about people wanting to move and be otherwise, new forms of movement, new aesthetic formations that question basically these rigid national and colonial structures. They look towards human autonomy, freedom. The interesting thing is, wherever you have a reaction, then you have a counter reaction, and so people respond to what is already there, out there, but quite often they are led back to the very structures that they left behind them. So we will look at this kind of interplay between structure and agency in some detail. Yes. And when we're talking about agencies, we are talking about both emotional and conceptual kind of freedoms that people and communities are seeking. And more specifically, what we're going to look at is the idea and the practice of tourism as a form of mass mobility, which involves moving away from your country, your family, your community, to experience novelties. And the strange thing with this, the origins of tourism are European mainly, is that it leads to the establishment of tourist systems. Yes, so from agency now we go back to systems, and the systems regulate then tourists and how they think or try to and how they act as consumers. So this is really the kind of irony of agential kind of reaction. We will also look at the development of medium systems and their role in definitions of modernity, because systems of mediatization are really important. On the one hand, for the dissemination of cosmopolitan ideas, yes, that move beyond the idea of national identity, but at the same time they were used for the strengthening of national identity and the nation state. So you see the irony again. And finally, we'll consider, of course, what it means to be a cosmopolitan and how different cultures cosmopolitanize, how people begin to think about themselves being parts of and citizens of the world rather than the nation state. So you can see how all this fits into what agencies and structures do to people. The third block looks at risk, order, and violence. One of the things that is associated with the experience and the organization, institutional aspects of modernity is what we call the rationalization of experience and generally rationalization. We start thinking about our behaviors and our participation in the world in more rational terms. Some of the things that are prominent in this rationalization is thinking about security, the aversion of risk to communities, and how we manage the expansion of the growth in populations. Yes, especially in cities, but not necessarily only there, because the earth is really massively populated at the moment, especially in certain areas, especially in Asia, for example. How are all these things managed? And what happens when we try to manage them to improve the human experience, but things go really wrong? The first point, of course, is to look at the development of urban formations, which, of course, produce new opportunities for people, because this is where most people will look for new jobs, for professional and personal development, for the reorganization of their life. And of course the aspiration is to live always a better life. So we have the migration, massive migration of human beings, human populations to cities, which begins in the 19th century and peaks really in the 20th century. With the First and the Second World War, we have more intensification of these migrations, especially from Europe to the United States and Australasia. We'll talk about some of these things. One of the things that this prompts, this constant population movement and the growth of communities. Yes, nations begin small and then they expand and expand and expand. This means that there is more diversity within them, is that people start, especially policymakers, to think about risks for populations, yes, and how to manage them. And together with thinking about risks, we have new policies that start, aspire at least to improve or correct these problems of risk. Now, in some cases, as I said, this went really wrong. Basically, what happens is that the project of improving society begins on positive terms, and it ends up sometimes to a variety of exclusions and eliminations of difference. And of course, the Holocaust is part and parcel of this phenomenon. Of course, alongside these things, we're going to talk more generally about living in the city, urbanization, and how people crowded in cities faced all sorts of problems of poverty, urban disorganization, a lack of housing, and all this. So, what we are looking at basically is combinations of order, disorder, risk, and violence in this block. In the fourth block, we look specifically at labor ideologies and how these begin to be restructured, especially in the second half of the 20th century. Because this is when we have this massive global labor flows. Yes, and together with these new flows, we have the reorganization of ways of thinking about labor. Yes, so we have the emergence of new ideological structures that deal with the management of work, yes, and labor populations. So the lectures that you will have will examine large-scale changes. They begin the lectures with the British Society, but then they move across the world to discuss these changes in other parts of the world. And they deal with some key concepts, and these concepts refer to particular processes, yes, and structures. One of them will be neoliberalism. What does it mean? It does connect to markets. Some say it's a market ideology. Some say it's a strategy. Yes. And it has to do basically with the management of the markets and the individuals that participate in them. Then we're going to look at some other alternative perspectives such as Fordism. So we have the increased division of labor and specialism. Something that back in the 19th century was discussed by Emile Durkheim, one of the known French sociologists, as a division of labor, becomes a lot more intensified when we reach to the point at which Fordist divisions of labor and production also are introduced from the 1970s. So what happens to labor in this context? What happens to practices of labor? Yes, so one of the things that has been replaced in more recent decades is manual work. Yes, what counts as productive skill? These days we are talking about cognitive capitalism. What capitalism draws on is not really our body and our embodied abilities, but our cognitive skills. Yes, so that's completely different from what used to happen even back in the 1970s. We are talking about post-industrial societies. What does this mean? Or knowledge societies, which takes us back to what I said about cognitive capitalism. The fifth block will be dedicated to social movements. So you can see from block 4 where again we reverted to thinking about large structures and systems. Here we go back to forms of collective action and agency. Because all this restructuring really produces its own nemesis, yes? It generates agency. And one of the ways people respond to these impositions is by organizing themselves in social movements, yes? So the lectures will discuss the ways common people resisted the imposition of capitalism back in the 17th, 18th century at the crack of modernity, yes? The pre-modern movements, even before that, and the call for democracy, yes, expansion of democracy. Chartism is one of the things that will be discussed extensively. And then we are going to move on to see what happens in more recent decades and the ways people continue to resist to forces of oppression and violence. We're going to talk about the new social movements which emerged from the late 1980s and especially the 1990s. Things that you know as the Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, yes, environmentalism, but other forms of political activism which are much more recent. And we will examine the role of information technologies in the mobilization of recent social movements. So these are the blocks, and you can see how we fluctuate from structure to modernity, modernity to agency, and then back. From structural impositions to freedom and autonomy, calls for freedom and autonomy, and then back. So they are all parts of the same puzzle, these blocks. They are not freestanding. Yes, the lecturers that will discuss these things with you in lectures specialize in them, but they also have more general knowledge of what is included in the module. If you discard one piece and you decide that maybe you take a holiday for a month, then you cannot comprehend the whole. So try to be good and not lose focus or favor the bits that you prefer or think you prefer, because unless you read, study and attend the lectures, you won't know what you deal with. One of the things that it will teach you, this module, is that when we are talking about forms of violence and calls for freedom, the two interconnect, and one sometimes leads to the other and then back. So one of the things that we want you to start thinking about that both agency and structure can be conservative. Yes. So even social movements can be very conservative sometimes and retrogressive. So be careful not to romanticize anything. And this is something that is usually omitted, but I have to say a few things about it. Please read your handbook, because we get emails that are answered in the handbook. And sometimes we won't answer them because you have all the information that you need. So the first point of call, apart from your tutor and not me, because I'm just the module director and one of the lecturers, is to have a look at your handbook and then talk to your tutor. Yes, your essay is a 2,000-word essay and has to be handed in by the 12th of May noon. For extensions, you have everything you need in the handbook. And don't leave this last minute, please. In terms of length, a plus minus 10% will be fine, but beyond that, unfortunately, you will be penalized. Referencing in your essay has to be in the Harvard style. Please don't come with one of the humanities styles because this is not really accepted. As for your tutorials, they will begin in week 3. I send you a message about that, but I reiterate and see in your handbook for which lectures each tutorial addresses. This tutorial attendance is monitored, and please don't start missing seminars. This is really from me. All I can say is happy semester, and we will meet again for a few more lectures with me next week. So I wish you the best with your studies, and I hope that it will be an enjoyable experience for you. Yeah.